So I want to talk a little bit about East Germany and its sort of battle for technology, because I think there's a lot to be learned on the possibilities of sort of state intervention in the technological sector, but also the huge risks that come with that when the state gets to decide where to invest, how to invest, and what it's all for. So I start in 1958 with Walter Ulbricht, the first secretary of East Germany, or of its ruling party rather, the SED, who declared at that point, so we're now kind of about sort of 9 years into the state, that he's had enough of the state being a kind of very sickly economy, people being very unhappy about that, and he wants to do something about it. And he declares at the party conference in 1958 that he wants to develop an economy, quote, within just a few years so that it proves once and for all the superiority of the socialist system of the GDR as compared to the imperialist forces of the Bond state. So there is, as ever in East Germany, this attempt to look westwards, because as people do, and the regime is very conscious of that, and it's looking at West Germany as a kind of bigger, more sizable, far more prosperous economy. West Germany has just gone through the economic miracle. And Walter Ulbricht realizes that he can't compete with that unless something changes. And so they come up with this early mantra of the GDR, which is overtaking without catching up. So the idea that they will once overtake, create a better economy without doing the same thing, without following a kind of path of what they saw as kind of hollow consumerism. So they needed to create a better economy rather than a bigger one. Now, even Walter Ulbricht realized that that is quite a steep hill to climb. The GDR economy, even by its own measurements, lagged around 30% behind the West German economy at that point. And it had all sorts of problems, fewer resources, for example. It was carrying the vast majority of the reparations load because the Soviet Union actually decided to take reparations from its side, whilst in the West there was kind of the opposite going on with Marshall Aid and an attempt to rebuild. So there were all sorts of issues on top of the idea of a planned economy that were holding East Germany back. And so the idea was that something needed to change structurally about the way that the economy worked. Or as Walter Ulbricht put it, we have little plaster, so we need to think faster. So the idea that there's very few resources and they need to make the most of them. And so they turned to technology, and the idea that technology would kind of be the saving grace of the East German economy, the thing that would make it all work, because it doesn't necessarily rely on huge amounts of resources. It relies on knowledge and on doing things differently. And so the socialist state began to invest enormous amounts of resources into sort of innovation, data processing, microelectronics. Walter Ulbricht himself was obsessed with the idea of microelectronics to a point where sort of the sort of dinosaurs around him were looking at this all as kind of futuristic nonsense, especially when he started talking about computers and things in the early 1960s, and people thought this was all a bit kind of the fantasies of an old man who wanted a legacy that he wanted to build. But initially this wasn't an outrageous kind of thing to do. Initially, actually, there were some signs for people that progress was coming. So these, for instance, the early models of the Trabant, later much belittled, because we all have these images in our minds of like 1989, when these kind of smelly two-stroke ancient machines really were rolling over into West Germany with lots of happy East Germans in them. But in the early 1960s, these early models were actually seen as fairly progressive. So you had them modeled, you can maybe see that on the Triumph Herald. In terms of their design originally, you had these kind of two-tone options there. They were two-stroke at the time, and even that was slightly behind, but not as much behind as it would later be. And then, of course, this kind of much belittled idea of them being kind of cardboard, cars. But actually, this Duroplast material that they developed, because they didn't have enough steel, was not unlike the sort of ideas of using glass fibers and other things, basically in other areas as well. And actually, when they crash tested them, they literally chucked them off a cliff to try and see what happened. They weren't unlike, say, for instance, the Mini Cooper and other cars at the time as well that were very similar in that respect. The problem came later when they didn't get developed and didn't move forward. Other areas there that people were kind of very enthusiastic about was the sort of space craze at the time. So the fact that East Germany contributed a lot of the kind of engineering, the technology that the Soviets used in terms of going to space, and then that kind of idea of the enthusiasm, the kind of excitement of it all that people had in the West as well, was shared in East Germany as well. So here you have little East German children waiting for Valentina Tereshkova, who was the first woman in space, and she came to Germany in 1963, much to the delight of lots of people, because they could see kind of a real cosmonaut coming. And there were lots of little boys and girls in East Germany who decided that that was going to be something that they wanted to do. It became kind of like a dream profession. And I think that stands in for the sort of progress optimism that Ulbricht's drive for technology kind of even asserted in people's minds. Whether it was actually real or not is a different question, but there was certainly a sense that finally the GDR is kind of consolidating itself through technology, and there seems to be a way forward. The first German in space, for example, was also an East German, Sigmund Jähn, much to the delight of the regime, which never stopped talking about that. People actually started to call sort of 50-yard distances 1 yen, because that was the distance between one poster of Sigmund Jähn and the next one on the street. So you'd say, I have to travel sort of 50 yens to get somewhere, because people were, he was that ubiquitous. Walter Ulbricht was also keen to then carry on with this success, and he put like a sort of group of think tanks, if you will, together. So there were several commissions and different groups of experts, and he said to them, well, look, this is going to be a problem into the future. Come up with a solution of how we can make the economy work. And they came up with something called the New Economic System, or the NES, which was surprisingly close to capitalism. And therefore worked. So basically they introduced market-like conditions, decentralized conditions into several sectors of the economy, where they said to individual companies, so take Carl Zeiss Jena as an example, which still makes kind of high quality kind of optics and precision lenses. Today, they were complaining in 1962, just before the NES policy came in, that the current state management of the way that they work was stopping it from, quote, concentrating on the development of the data processing technology needed for the completion of Zeiss's own measuring devices. And they were listening, actually, at this point, 1963, 64, they were actually listening to that sort of feedback from individual specialists, telling them we need to be able to do our own thing. If you want us to create kind of really high quality technology, then just let us get on with it. And Ulbricht actually at this point responds to it. He put somebody in charge that knew what those pressures felt like. So this is Erich Appel, who was one of the rocket engineers on the Nazis' military programs in Peenemünde. So whilst that's not necessarily something that commended him as such, it meant that he was in a position where he knew what it felt like to work under a kind of really invasive ideology, under politics, and yet produce results somehow. And therefore he was put in charge of this program and pushed for more decentralization. And as a result of that, in the 60s, you see GDP go up. Even the West German Cologne Center of Historical Social Science reckoned that the GDR was catching up, and it reckoned that in the first few years of the 1960s it was catching up 5% of that 30% gap. So it was beginning to look like something was changing, and this kind of technological drive in particular was at the heart of this. However, the problem is, of course, that they're operating in a really rigid socialist system of control. And so any innovative kind of zeal is always dependent on political whim of the day. So effectively, when you look at Walter Ulbricht at that point, he's getting very old. So here he is in 1971. He's in his late 70s at that point. He would die 2 years after this, and at this point, he's still kind of rambling on about processors and microelectronics, and people just look at him as if he was kind of getting a bit senile, getting a bit kind of worried about his legacy, and the people around him think it's all nonsense. Let's concentrate on a sort of heavy industry and go back to the sort of workers type state that they'd envisioned. None of this kind of fancy electrical stuff. The other problem was that the Soviet Union was increasingly skeptical about involving East Germany in any of its kind of more sensitive technological developments. And so whenever Ulbricht went to them and said, look, we want to do this microelectronics program, can you share your stuff with us? They said no. And so effectively, Walter Ulbricht went, fine, then we'll do our own thing. And his relationship with the Soviet Union began to break, and that was one of the many reasons why he had to go in 1971. And his successor, Erich Honecker, basically had to prove to the Soviet Union that he'd do things differently, and kind of went back to a more traditional sort of industry-style economy in the early 1970s. Günther Mittag, who's one of the key kind of economics people in the GDR, complained years later, we don't really know what he thought at the time, but he complained years later that if Honecker labored under the illusion that he could kind of progress the GDR's economy and its technology sector together with the Soviet Union, he said that was an illusion, basically, that it was possible for the GDR to do that, to move on with the Soviet Union. Honecker began to realize that as well throughout the 1970s, and he began to look for other partners to actually start this technological drive up again. And unsurprisingly, he came up with Japan as a possible partner, because there was nobody else within the Soviet sphere, basically, that was as advanced as the GDR, and Japan seemed a good bridge between the sort of culture of commonality, of group thinking, but at the same time having a highly developed technological sector at this point with Sony, Toshiba, and so on and so forth. And they'd already worked together in the 70s. The main thing that he wanted out of this was kind of radios, consumer technology, cassette recorders, the Walkman eventually, because people were obsessed with this in the West as much as in the East. And he was kind of traveling to Japan on a full state visit in 1981 to try and work out how the Japanese did all of that, and how they can maybe import some of that into the UK. And so the idea was to build up a kind of GDR internal technological sector that would come up with this sort of stuff. And on that state visit in 1981, they came up with a trades package, so between the GDR and Japan, to the tune of $440 million US. And that meant that the stuff could actually develop more quickly in the GDR. So, for example, in 1980, they already had 105 television sets per 100 households, so pretty much everybody had one, which was a huge issue earlier. And then they were building up things like factories for affordable cassette recorders, for example. That took quite a while, because they were trying once again to do a GDR internally. And so they went to different state-run companies and said to them, you need to make sure that you develop us a kind of nice, affordable technology. But that wasn't something that they could inherently do, because they'd been told for 10 years previously to kind of, put stuff out there that was relevant for other industries. So they had no expertise in this sort of field. And the guy who was put in charge of this, Carl Nendel, he was the state secretary for the Ministry for Electrical Engineering and Electronics, went to the director of one of these companies and completely vented his frustration with the lack of process. He shouted at him in his face, "You must understand that it is politically necessary to finally have our own cassette recorders." Whilst this is a ridiculous thing in hindsight, he put up so much pressure onto this poor guy that he clutched his chest and collapsed with a heart attack. And he was brought into hospital. And then when Nendel wrote down his memoirs in the late 1990s, he said, "Oh, maybe I overdid it a little bit," but then finished the same sentence with, "But it was politically necessary that we had our own cassette recorders." And I thought that was just brilliant. They really haven't stopped thinking that way, those of them that are still around. And that, I think, is the crux of it. You've got something like cassette recorders, TVs, kind of consumer technology, that should be in the hands of people who think, how do I design this? How do I make this so that it appeals to a mass audience? And yet they see it as something that is politically necessary, and that's why the money is invested in that. And that's kind of where this stuff all went wrong. So going into this political kind of end of it, because it is so political, the development of technology, a lot of the funding actually went to the Stasi. Which was led by Erich Mielke, who had been trained as a terrorist in Moscow in the 1930s, and then went on to fight in the Spanish Civil War as a terrorist. So people like that are now in charge of what technology gets developed and how. And so it's maybe not surprising that they saw it as a kind of question of survival of the state. That's where most of the funding should go. So they came up with pretty ridiculous things, like all sorts of spy cameras that they developed, which were kind of, this is the sort of stuff that Carl Zeiss is being put used to, in terms of you've got this really specialized high optic or kind of, company, and it's now being told, make us little spy cameras that fit into somebody's suit pocket, or even things like, lipsticks that were converted into little cameras so that the secretary could sort of sit there, and it was triggered by actually opening the lipsticks kind of lit up, then the camera would turn on, and she could then film sort of documents and things like that. And that's where most of the money, most of the attention went to, when it could have gone into developing a genuinely working kind of technological sector, if you will. Instead, you had these kind of really high-tech stuff basically within the Stasi. So this is called the OTS, the Operative Technological Sector, where they basically put systems in place so that they could tune into 4,000 telephone conversations at the same time. These were then all recorded on little cassette tapes, of which there weren't enough for the ordinary population to record music and listen to at the same time because of that. They even did this to their own staff, so you ended up basically with the Stasi itself, monitoring the Stasi itself, kind of doing the same thing. So this man there sitting there would himself be, sort of listened to and spied upon. So the point of all of this is that I think the fact that the GDR managed so much more than a lot of the other states that didn't believe in technology shows that state intervention in the sector can actually achieve a lot. The huge pitfall is that the focus is always on something very purposefully political, very kind of designed to benefit the state rather than the population as a whole. And so I think there's a lot to be learned about the sort of focus of the state or state involvement in technology, be that the good, the bad, or the ugly.
Thank you. First, where do I find the Deutsche Spionage Museum?
In Berlin?
In Berlin. Is it open every day?
I don't know, to be honest, but the lipstick, for example, is there.
Your wonderful story is an illustration of statecraft, because sort of you can say the what was right, the idea was right, the start was promising, and they even tried to solve the how by introducing this NES, and suddenly it failed. Why did this promising statecraft project fail?
I think ultimately because the purpose was so political. So you had somebody like Ulbricht, who I think genuinely at various points had the interest of his population at heart. I think he was a genuine idealist in some respects. The problem was that both he and Mielke came out of a field that's very dominated by the Second World War, which they'd spent in the Soviet Union under the kind of Stalinist purges. Both of them just about survived that. So 9 people of the Politburo within East Germany, the Communist Party's Politburo, went to the Soviet Union during the 1930s and 1940s. Only 2 of them were still alive at the end of the war because they'd fallen victim to Stalin's paranoia. And that's not a coincidence. They come out of that sort of environment, and now give them something like new technology, and they'll instantly think, okay, how can we use this to control, to coerce, to protect ourselves, to make sure that we stay in power. And I think that's the problem, basically. You start off with a good intention, and then very quickly the old habits kind of keep creeping back in.
Thank you for this instructive story. Thank you, Katya.